Welcome back to our second week of ABS 312, Structure and Function in Plants and Animals. We're going to do a little bit of review from last week, going over natural selection again and making sure we understand that. And then we're going to move on to something called sexual selection, which actually was Darwin's second big idea. So he came up with this really cool idea of sexual selection and how organisms are selected for traits that help them basically get their genes into the next generation. As I said, when he was first looking at on the origin of the species, he was looking at traits that helped organisms survive. Surviving's great, wonderful, you can live to a really old life, but if you don't get your genes into the next generation, what is it all for? Is it really worth doing? So we're going to start looking at sexual selection. Sexual selection is near and dear to my heart. I get super excited about it because this is kind of where my heart lies as far as what I do in my previous research and where my interests lie in relation to mating systems, how animals reproduce, how animals get offspring into the next generation, and what structures, etc., are used to be able to do that. I love to look at videos of mating dances and look at apes, and there are different types of breeding relationships, etc. Super interesting to me. So I'm really excited to be able to share this with you, hence why I chose to make one of our concentrations sexual selection, because I think that it's so interesting and how the behaviors are brought in and how the structures are brought in and how those are used and the costs and benefits of those different structures. So let's look at sexual selection as we review a little bit of natural selection and then move into what sexual selection actually is. So our topics for this lecture are to look at what was natural selection again. We want to remember what we learned last week. We want to look at adaptation. What were adaptations? What were some of the adaptations that we looked at last week? And then we're going to move into some new stuff, looking at sexual selection. What are some constraints on evolution? What are we able to do as far as organisms are able to evolve into the next generation, what we're not, and then how within a population genetic variation is able to be maintained. So natural selection basically removes individuals that are less suited to the environment. So survival of the fittest, whoever adapts best gets to move on, whoever doesn't basically ends up dying off in the current environment. Natural selection also amplifies the presence of favorable traits and the alleles that go on with those favorable traits in the population. So those alleles become more frequent within the population. We know that natural selection requires genetic variation. If there's no variation within the population, then obviously there's nothing to be selected for. And natural selection does not happen in a day. It happens over hundreds, thousands of years. Evolutionary time is very slow. So you're not going to see an automatic change tomorrow. It's going to take years and years of time for that to be seen generally. Natural selection leads to adaptation. We talked about that because organisms, as their traits are selected for, they become better and better adapted to their current environment. That's one thing that we have to keep in our brains, is that they're becoming better and better adapted to their current environment. If somehow this environment suddenly changes, the place that they find themselves suddenly changes, they may no longer be adapted. These traits may no longer be suitable for them, and they may end up being the ones that end up dying out. But currently, in the fairly stable environment in which they're living, they are being selected for adaptations. Adaptation is both a trait, okay? Something that you see in an animal or plant or other organism, fungus, bacteria, whatever, that adapts it for its environment, and it's a process. We are adapting to our environments as we go throughout time. So we have to remember that. And that natural selection is the evolutionary process whereby a population becomes better suited to its habitat. So over time, populations become better suited because individuals become better suited. And those individuals then are more representative within the population. So the population as a whole becomes better adapted. So natural selection can select a feature which is important for an organism's survival and reproduction. Okay, that's an adaptation. A feature important for an organism's survival and often reproduction. Not always, but often reproduction. So for instance, the hummingbird's long and straight bill. Hummingbirds need nectar. They need to be able to get into these really long flowers. They've adapted a really long and straight bill that allows them to get the food that they need in order to be able to feed their offspring, feed themselves, continue into the next generation. The horse's grinding teeth, adapted to the type of food that it's eating once again. So, on to Darwin's second big idea. Here's a picture of his second publication, or his second really big publication, called The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. So Darwin kind of went back and looked at his data and his idea of natural selection and realized that there was kind of more to it. That we had these traits that were being selected for surviving within the population over a long period of time. But as I said, survival is not all it's cracked up to be if you can't get your genes into the next generation. So he saw that there was more to it. He started looking at these traits that weren't necessarily particularly selecting for survival, but they were selecting for organisms being able to get their genes into the next generation. And so he saw that there was more going on than just straight natural selection. So he started looking at that and looking at some of these relationships. So looking at sexual selection, we're going to look at that for the whole next 4 weeks in different ways. We're going to look at first at male-male competition in week 3, and then we're going to look at female choice. Females can be choosy, and we're going to look at that in week 4. In week 5, we're going to look at female-female competition, potentially for mates and for getting their offspring into the next generation. And then the 4th week of this bunch is going to look at plants and sexual selection in plants. Now, there's some debate over whether sexual selection actually exists in plants. We'll talk about why that is, but we're certainly going to look at it. We're going to look at the evidence that is out there. We're going to look at some videos, and we're going to make a decision for our own based on the evidence that we have. So here you can see this beautifully colored bird. Generally in birds, males tend to be the prettiest. Females generally are fairly plain, not so pretty, and that is because females get to choose. Females don't need to be pretty. Males need to be pretty in order for females to choose them to get their genes into the next generation. So watch this little video. We're going to obviously do some more videos on bird mating because I think that it is absolutely so cool, the dances that they do and the colors that they are. And you will laugh, I promise, because they're really, really funny, but really, really cool. And so watch this first one. And then when we get to looking at male-male competition, we'll see some more of these crazy videos.
In the great island of New Guinea, there are 42 different species of birds of paradise, each more bizarre than the last. This forest is so rich that nourishing food can be gathered very quickly. That leaves the male six-plumed bird of paradise with time to concentrate on other matters, like tidying up his display area. Everything must be spick and span. All is ready. Very impressive, but no one is watching. The superb bird of paradise calls to attract a female. And he has more luck. But what does he have to do to really impress her? She retires to consider her verdict. It's hard not to feel deflated when even your best isn't good enough.
So, moving on with sexual selection. Sexual selection has to do with traits that affect reproductive success. So getting your genes into the next generation. How fit are your genes? How many copies of your genes can you get into the next generation? Sexual selection favors traits that increase reproductive success. Okay? Sometimes it favors traits that may lead to a cost to survival. So Darwin was looking at natural selection and at traits that led to better survival. Sometimes sexual selection and natural selection are kind of fighting each other, because during sexual selection there may be traits that are selected in order to get genes into the next generation that actually may detrimentally affect the survival of that organism. And so how these two things work together to make that happen. So fitness, the contribution of a genotype. Okay, genotype is our two alleles, what our genes actually say, or phenotype, what is expressed, to the genetic composition of subsequent generations relative to the contribution of other genotypes or phenotypes. So how many of your genotypes or how many of your phenotypes end up in that next generation in comparison to Joe Schmo over here or Silly Sally over here? How many copies of their generations did they get into the next generation? Okay, so how fit are you? If you're really fit, woo, you got offspring all over the place. Maybe Joe Schmo and Silly Sally are not quite so fit and they didn't end up with offspring in the next generation. So, some examples of that. We're going to look at a lot of male-male competition. Male-male competition can often be very, very brutal. A lot of these traits are selected for in order to increase success during male-male competition battles. Looking at an example in elephant seals. Okay, elephant seal males, very, very, very large. Males fight and the largest often wins. Okay, a lot of it has to do with weight, and basically they don't have feet, so they're throwing their bodies around, they're slamming their heads together. There's a little video here, you can watch it happen. It is very, very brutal, but generally the largest male wins. And when you win, you get the spoils and you get the females and you get to get your offspring into the next generation. Okay, so he was selected to be large. What kind of genes do you think he's going to pass on to the next generation? He's going to pass on genes to his male offspring that are going to make them big too. So if you come from a big male, you're generally going to continue to be a large male, continue to be dominant in the population. Not always, but often. Dominant males get over 80% of the matings. So you can see it's not 100%. There are subordinate males that are kind of sneaking in maybe some places, catching matings where they can, not winning competitions, but still getting some of their genes into the next generation. But generally, the largest males are the ones that are getting the matings and therefore getting their genes. And so over time, elephant seal males have been selected for getting larger and larger and larger because those larger genes are getting passed into the next generations multiple times over. So there's a sexual selection for larger and larger body size, because the larger the body size, the more likely you are to succeed in getting your genes into the next generation. However, there's also a cost to this. Male elephant seals tend to die 2 to 3 years earlier than females because they have larger bodies, they beat up on each other all the time, they get injured. There's other physiological relationships inside their body that allows them to end up dying sooner. So once again, you have that sexual selection and natural selection fighting each other. This trait is being selected in order to get genes into the next generation, but it is therefore causing the organism to die off sooner. So it's hitting back on survival while it's increasing fitness of getting reproduction into the next generation. So, as I said, sexual selection and natural selection can often be counteracting forces. One can be selected for, which then inhibits something else. So a male with more conspicuous coloration or behavior is more vulnerable to predation. So these males, you'll see when we get to the videos, seriously hilarious how much these dancing birds do out in the environment in order to attract a female. And the more they're out dancing, the more likely they are to be spotted by a predator and eaten. Okay, the brighter they are, the more they dance, the more they're out in the environment, the more likely they are to die. And yet, these traits are still selected for because they're more likely to get their genes into the next generation. So it's kind of a catch-22 there, but we're going to look at sexual selection versus natural selection. We're going to look at the costs and benefits of these traits being selected for and why they continue to persist in the environment. Obviously, there has to be, generally, if they're going to persist, more benefit than cost. But we're going to look at the relationship between those two. So, even if the trait causes males to die earlier, it's still beneficial if that male, while it was living, is able to get more copies of its genes into the next generation. All right, let's look now at constraints on evolution. So we've been talking about evolution, change over time, natural selection, sexual selection, traits being selected for, being better adapted to environments. So now we have to look at what kind of limits those abilities to change. So we looked at lack of genetic variation. Okay, without variation, we are not able to select favorable traits because there's no difference. There's nothing to be selected for because everything is the same. So if an allele for that particular trait does not exist in the population, it's not going to suddenly poof up and potentially exist in the population, therefore it cannot be selected for. Once it's lost from the population, generally it's not coming back. So that kind of creates a problem sometimes. Evolution can only work on what is already existing. So we are not poofing anything into existence. We kind of got rid of the idea that things are created the way that they are, that things can kind of just be created and there you go, something new. We have to work on the theory of natural selection, that everything is related from a common ancestor and we can only create things based on what is already existing. So we can make changes to what already exists, but we aren't able to create anything new. So looking at, for instance, flatfish eye migration, okay? So like flounders, etc., that lay on the bottom of the ocean. Weirdly, both of their eyes are on the same side of their head. What do you think we would look like if we had both of our eyes on the same side of our head? Pretty weird. But genetically, ancestrally, their eyes were on two sides of their head. One eye on either side of their head, and then as they moved throughout generations, the eye started migrating across their head. Pretty darn weird. But you end up with these flatfish that lay on the ground all the time. It wouldn't make sense if one of their eyes was on the ground. They wouldn't be able to see anything out of it. So evolutionarily, it has moved that their eyes now exist both on the same side of their head, which is pretty funky. But obviously we had to start with an ancestor that had eyes on either side of its head and then modify from there. We couldn't just poof, here's a fish that has eyes on both sides or one side of its head. Cost and benefit analysis. That's a lot of what we're going to be doing this semester, is looking at costs and benefits of different traits that are selected for. Obviously, in order to be selected for, in order to continue to persist in the environment, the benefit has to outweigh the cost. Okay, so we're going to look at that. The trade-off has to be worthwhile. Say you end up dying 5 years earlier, but during that first 10 years that you were able to live, you got, I don't know, 1 million different copies of your genes into the next generation, then maybe that was worth it. Species in which males have multiple mates are what we call polygynous. We're going to look at different mating strategies, different types of social groups within organisms. Males are generally larger in polygynous relationships. So males have multiple mates. You've got multiple males and multiple females. Males are selected to be larger, and they often have weapons, horns, antlers, etc., things that are going to allow them to compete with fellow males better. So things that make them tough. Okay? Females don't need to have things like this generally, because generally females are not competing physically, at least. We're going to look at female-female competition, and they are competing, but they're competing differently. So dramatic differences between sexes are known as sexual dimorphism, where you have the male looking very, very different from the female. And I'm sure that we can all think of examples of that. But here are a couple. So you have pheasants here, pretty colors, long tails, very drab female, particularly in birds. Females often look very drab. And as I said, it's because they're choosy. They don't have to look pretty because they get to pick. Here we have some really long tail feathers. Okay, that would be on a male bird. Here's our beautiful male peacock with these giant feathers and this huge tail and dancing around with it sticking up in the air. And here's our female just kind of hanging out, looking around, seeing which male can show off the best and who has the prettiest feathers, etc. Then we have our lions over here, our male lion with this big old mane, and our female lion looking very, very different. Often these traits are a result of sexual selection, and these traits are selected for because they help the male get more copies of his genes into the next generation. So in these polygynous species, male-male competition, they have to defend their territories, they have to defend their females against other males. They want to continue getting their genes into the next generation. Defensive structures require a lot of energy, but the male has a lot of reproductive success as an exchange, okay? So here you can see some bighorn sheep slamming into each other. I would think I would get a concussion. They do it over and over and over again. And you can see, like in some of the videos that you watch, that they're kind of, whoa, after they're done, a little bit shaky after they smack into each other. But generally, the male who succeeds the best gets to mate with all these females and produce lots and lots of offspring. Okay, so those are constraints that we have to work under. And then we're going to look at how genetic variation is maintained, okay? We have some different ways. We want to maintain variation because we can't select without variation. So how do we do that? We look at using sexual reproduction. Okay, we're going to look in just a minute at asexual versus sexual reproduction. Okay, hopefully in Bio 182, we learned about sexual reproduction versus asexual reproduction. In sexual reproduction, you have the process of meiosis happening, you have your genes splitting, you have crossing over happening where different chromosomes can exchange parts of each other, and then you have segregation into different gametes, and then you have the male gamete and the female gamete coming together, and there's a whole lot of variation that is able to be created through sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction, there's only one individual involved. The offspring are all clones of the single individual. Not much variation there because they're all exactly the same. Looking at something called frequency-dependent selection. Third, environmental variation, 4 subpopulations and 5 mutations. We're going to walk through each of these pieces separately. So looking at first at sexual reproduction, I talked about this. New combinations of genes, different gametes, different chromosomes appearing in those gametes, crossing over, independent assortment, all those kinds of things contribute to greater genetic variation within these organisms. Second, sexual reproduction also has disadvantages, okay? Sometimes when you have genes that are close together, or on the same chromosome, and suddenly they're beneficial to each other when they're on the same chromosome, and suddenly they cross over and now one's over here and one's over here on different chromosomes, and they may end up being entirely separated. That might be a problem for adaptation. Individuals also only get to pass half their genes. Okay, when you're asexual reproduction, you pass your entire genes to your offspring. So everything that your offspring is you. Okay, sexual reproduction, we only get to pass half. Okay, we've cut it in half. That's a huge reduction. Dividing into genders, okay, we now have male and we have female. So your overall reproductive rate is going to decrease because you as a female or you as a male are now only half the population. We need a male and a female to come together. Whereas with asexual reproduction, generally all females, there's no two genders needed. You can pass down your entire genome, and you don't need males, ladies. So we're actually going to play a game further on in the class that looks at lizards. And we're going to have some asexual lizards, and we're going to have some sexual lizards, and we're going to look at the costs and benefits of sexual versus asexual reproduction, what energy costs go into both, what genetic costs go into both, and kind of analyze what we think might be best for these lizards. It'll be a lot of fun. It's kind of challenging, actually, in looking at the different aspects that male lizards in sexual reproduction, female lizards in sexual reproduction, female asexual reproduction lizards have to go through. It's kind of an interesting little exercise. So, looking at sexual reproduction does not affect the frequency of alleles, but generates new combinations of alleles. All right, we talked about that already. We're not affecting frequency, but we're just basically putting everything in a bag and shaking it up and dumping it out and seeing what comes out. So, asexual reproduction, as I said, not a whole lot of variation. If something is actually going to change within that asexual population, it takes a really, really long time for a potential mutation to suddenly show up, and way longer than sexual reproduction because you just don't have that variation. So during asexual reproduction, offspring can be produced relatively quickly, so that's a benefit. There's relatively low energy investment in producing asexual reproduction. You'll see that when we do our little exercise with the lizards. There's not a whole lot of energy investment, but there's a huge lack of genetic diversity because you produce clones instead of producing new genetically different offspring. That's great until suddenly the environment changes and your clones are completely unadapted to the new environment. Then pretty much your entire population is going to fall to the wayside, going to die, and you're done. Dun, dun, dun. What happens next? Okay? That's a problem because then you kind of disappear from the population. Thirdly, we look at environmental variation. Different environments creates genetic variation because certain organisms over here are going to keep alleles that adapt them to this type of environment. Certain organisms over here are going to maintain alleles that adapt them to this type of environment. For example, we have some Colias butterflies here. They live in an environment with temperature extremes, so we have really cold, really hot, things like that. Variation in environment. And there are actually two different types of butterflies that are maintained because of these variations in environment. There is an enzyme that influences flight at different temperatures. So if you are a heterozygote, okay, you maintain one allele for cold, one allele for warm, two different alleles at that trait for the enzyme, then you're able to fly over a greater range of temperature. So basically, the heterozygote is selected for because it has a benefit to the population, and therefore you end up with both cold and warm adapted butterflies maintaining in the population. Interestingly, sickle cell anemia in humans is the same way. Sickle cell anemia is caused by a single base pair in the DNA being changed, and therefore the protein that is produced from the process of transcription and translation, hemoglobin, is made entirely differently. The shape is different. It causes the red blood cells to be sickle shaped, and allow them to carry much less oxygen than they would be able to otherwise. This causes lots and lots of different problems within a person who actually has sickle cell anemia. In order to phenotypically show the trait of sickle cell anemia, you have to have 2 copies of the recessive trait. So you have to have 2 recessives, and then you show sickle cell anemia. And you get all these health problems, potential health problems. So it would make sense to think, why is this gene being maintained in the environment? You would think if people that have it and show it are dying off, that potentially the allele frequency would decrease within the population and it would go away finally. But the reason that this does not happen is that in the heterozygote situation where you have 1 recessive allele and 1 dominant allele, that actually conveys benefit to people who live in areas in which malaria is a problem. Heterozygotes for sickle cell anemia have a resistance to malaria. And given that sickle cell anemia is most common in African Americans, and the homeland, potentially the place where African Americans came from, is in Africa where malaria is a real problem, then these heterozygotes tend to stay in the population. And therefore, the allele continues to be maintained even though it happens to be deleterious as far as health concerns go. So just an interesting example of that. Subpopulations in different geographic regions maintain genetic variation. So there may be, within an overall population, that population might be broken up into subpopulations, okay, that are subjected to different environmental conditions. So for example, white clover. Okay, there are subpopulations of white clover that produce cyanide as a defense against herbivores. Okay, an herbivore is something that eats a plant, an organism that eats a plant. And so particular white clover that are exposed to herbivores on a regular basis have developed a way to produce cyanide in themselves, which then poisons their herbivores. And there are also particular plants that produce, the ones that produce cyanide are more likely to be killed by frost, however, and so they are less likely to be able to survive in areas where there is lots of cold weather. And so you end up with variations, some that are adapted to cold weather and where they live, and some that are adapted to fighting off herbivores and yet can't live in cold weather because of the environmental differences within these different subpopulations. So we are going to look at, as I said, the costs and benefits of sexual selection. Male-male competition, as I said, often very, very brutal. Males compete for lots of things. They compete for resources, they compete for food, they compete for territory, they compete for mates. Basically, all of those things have to do with how well they can control their resources and show to a female that they are robust, that they have good genes, and that it would be a good idea for her to breed with them in order to take those good genes into the next generation. So the way that a male can provide food for his family, the way that a male can defend a territory, etc., all of those cues give ideas to the female about that male's genes and how fit those male genes would be in her offspring. So all of it combines to basically be selecting for the potential for that male to get his genes into the next generation. Secondly, we're going to look at female choice. Okay, as I said, a lot of females are not all that decorative, beautiful, pretty, things like that, because generally females get to be the ones to choose which male they're going to breed with. Females have a lot more at stake when it comes to raising offspring. Okay, and you're gonna, well, you'll look at that a little bit in your lizard exercise, but females, for one, the egg takes a lot more energy input into producing the egg than it does into a little tiny sperm. So immediately the female's investment in that offspring is higher. Then the female, at least in mammals, humans, things like that, female has to carry the offspring, pregnancy. Female has to lactate to feed the offspring, and females often are the only ones contributing to the raising of the offspring. Often the male does his thing, deposits whatever, and boom, off, done. Very, very little investment. So females have huge investment compared to a male and therefore have to be more choosy. If all they're getting from the male is his contribution of the sperm, they want to make sure those sperm are as fit as possible in getting into their offspring. So females tend to be very, very choosy in order to increase the odds of their offspring surviving into the next generation. So we're going to look at that. And then in the third week of animals sexual selection, we're going to look at female competition. Okay, females do compete. They compete in different ways than males do, but we're going to look at female competition and how that type of competition happens. Looking at different mating situations, social situations, groupings, etc., and why female would have to compete with each other for access to the males. So we're going to look at under which circumstances that might occur. And then finally, we are going to look at sexual selection in plants in our fourth week of this grouping. As I said, some people think sexual selection happens. Some people think sexual selection doesn't happen in plants. Generally, sexual selection happens in organisms that are able to make choices about who they're going to breed with. In order to make choices about who you're going to breed with, generally you have to be able to move around. And actually, I'm going to choose this guy as opposed to I'm going to choose this guy. Well, plants are kind of stuck. Plants don't get to choose who their neighbors are. Plants are stuck where they're at, and they just have to deal with the people who happen to be around them, whether they like them or not. Okay? So, we want to look at the idea, does sexual selection exist for plants? And there is some research out there showing that yes, it does. And we're going to look at that. I have been consulting with some of my plant experts, and I'm getting some of their ideas on whether this exists, what evidence there is out there for it, and we're going to kind of analyze this and see how much it exists, what these traits are being selected for, why they're being selected, etc. So potentially like really big flowers or things like that that maybe are not particularly beneficial to the plant, but help the plant attract pollinators, which is then going to take their pollen to the next plant and help them to get their traits into the next generation. So you might be surprised, but we will examine the evidence and decide for ourselves whether we really think that sexual selection exists in plants. So that is the end of our official lecture for week number 2, looking at sexual selection. Kind of wraps up our introduction to the course. And we are now going to be moving into our 3 different concentrations. So our first concentration being sexual selection. For the next 4 weeks, we will be looking at different types of competition in sexual selection. And then we will go, as I said, into our Sonoran Desert adaptations as our second concentration, and then into our coevolution, predator-prey relationships, and symbiosis in the third concentration. So hang on to your hats. We're going to have some fun. We get to start looking at the fun stuff now, and hopefully you will enjoy it. It will be a thinking process for you in how these traits exist and why, and we should have a lot of fun. So thanks.